Welcome back to our series covering Margaret Barker's paper Temple, and Timaeus present as a chapter in her book, The Great High Priest. This time it will be a bit different, however I have a new laptop that's higher end, albeit not as user-friendly as I like, and am experimenting with utilizing 11 Labs AI to speed output on some videos by cloning my voice starting with this video. In any case, I hope you enjoy it, and since I'm gearing towards more consistent video production, it would be a good time for subscribers to post feedback and requests in the comments. Pythagoras. Pythagoras left no writings, and there was a tradition of silence among his disciples. Theirs was a secret tradition, exactly what was claimed for the temple priesthood, and so comparisons are not easy. Such information as survives has to be gleaned in the first instance from the fragments of Philolaus of Croton, a late 5th century Pythagorean who was the first to write down the teachings of Pythagoras, and from the works of Aristotle, who was not sympathetic to Pythagoras' teachings. Aristotle warned about distinguishing pre-Platonic from Platonic material, and elements from Aristotle's lost treatise on the Pythagoreans survive as quotations elsewhere. Ancient commentators were unanimous that what he developed in his treatise on the good were Pythagorean. There is other material in later sources which was formerly regarded as dubious, but recent scholarship has had a more favorable opinion. The world of the First Temple has to be reconstructed in a similar way, from fragments and from the references in later, often hostile writers. We have to distinguish between Deuteronomic and non-Deuteronomic sources, and recent scholarship here too has a more favorable opinion of the value of information preserved only in later text. The situation is not ideal, but the similarities between the teachings associated with Pythagoras and those of the First Temple priests are too many to be mere coincidence. This is not to suggest that Pythagoras had studied in Jerusalem. It is possible that the traditions of Jerusalem priesthood were not unique to that one place, and that Pythagoras had simply encountered them in the region. The priests of the First Temple had suffered massive disruption and expulsions in the time of Josiah's purges, and it could have been their scattered descendants from whom Pythagoras learned. There is insufficient evidence to establish anything with certainty, and Burkert's warning about the teaching of Pythagoras is important. A perfectly certain interpretation of a philosophy is impossible when it is known to us only indirectly and mostly in the context of polemic. This is also true of any attempt to reconstruct the pre-Josianic temple. The number of striking similarities in apparently trivial details, however, together with more fundamental correspondences, could indicate that the worldview of the older temple prompted Pythagoras' later scientific investigations, and was the mythological framework which so many scholars posit, but none can identify. Most of the information about Pythagorean lore concerning the creation is thought to have come through Philolaus, and Burkert argued that Philolaus actually created the abstract form of Pythagoras' worldview. It was mythology in a scientific clothing. Aristotle implies this. Pythagoreans do not seek accounts and explanations in conformity with appearances, but try by violence to bring the appearances into line with accounts and opinions of their own, on the heavens 293a. If this was the case, the task would be to compare what lay beneath the later scientific accounts of the teaching of Pythagoras with the earliest strata in the Hebrew Scriptures. This does show more than a series of random correspondences. It is clearly two similar systems, one which existed as a coherent whole in a temple setting, and another whose origin and characteristic mixture of images and concepts is unrelated to that of its environing culture, and remains a complete mystery. The pivotal conceptions of Pythagoras' system were identified by Cornford as the ideal of ecoming like God and the notion of mimesis, the correspondence of macrocosm and microcosm, the conception of harmony, and the symbol known as the tetractys. There is ample and obvious evidence in the tradition of the First Temple for becoming like God, with King as the divine Son and apotheosis appearing in the Enochic histories. There is also the Holiness Code, which even in its Mosaic form exhorts all the people to become holy ones because their Lord is holy, Levermentst 26. This was very different from the customary Greek view that gods and mortals were separate orders, but Pythagoras is said to have taught that gods and men are akin inasmuch as man partakes of heat. Diogenes Laertius 8:27. The original temple tradition was the correspondence of macrocosm and microcosm, with Moses being told on Sinai to make the tabernacle according to what he had seen in his vision on the mountain, at Exodus 45 points, 30. The words of Deutero-Isaiah in the aftermath of the cultural upheaval of Josiah and the exile show that mimesis was a controversial issue. To whom will you liken God, or with what likeness compare him? And then, the image that will not move, words that anticipated by 2 centuries Plato's phrase, Issa, Theory Chal, 1820. The other examples, harmony and the tetracties, can also be found in the older temple tradition, as we shall see. Some more isolated examples. Pythagoras established that the morning star was identical with the evening star, yet this was known from the mythology of Ugarit and appears in echoes from the older temple. Pythagoras claimed that the world was round, Stragil, Diogenes Laertius 848. The older Hebrew creation story often mentioned the Jabudug, translated the circle of the earth, Isa 30:22, or the circle drawn on the face of the deep, Proverbs 8:7, Job 26:10, and the dome of the heaven, Job 2:9. Pythagoras was the first to call himself a philosopher, a lover of wisdom. He invented the word. If wisdom had been banished from the Jerusalem temple in Josiah's purge, it is not impossible that her devotees in the temple had had a name such as this. The book of Proverbs does imply that this term was used. Do not forsake wisdom, and she will keep you. Love her, and she will guard you. Proverbs 4 or 6. He who loves wisdom makes his father glad. Proverbs 29:3. Philolaus associated masculine divinities with the triangle and feminine with the square, which coincides with the older temple tradition. The Lord was enthroned in the temple between the 2 creatures, or appeared as 3 angels, Genrat, and the living one was a 4-fold presence. Burkert said of this example, one might be tempted to ignore all this as a side growth on the main stem of Pythagorean wisdom, but more careful examination reveals that this kind of lore is to be recognized not as a branch, but as a root, and one which goes very deep. The 4-fold living one, as Ezekiel described her in his vision, contained within herself all life, and in Proverbs 8:30 she was described as the bond or harmony of the creation. She was the mother of the sons of God, the angelic powers. The Pythagoreans used to invoke the tetracties as their most binding oath. Nay, by him that gave our generation the tetracties, which contains the fount and roots of eternal nature, e.g. Aetius 1.38, but this was frequently quoted. A likely origin for the tetracties is Ezekiel's 4-fold living one, and so Burkert's conclusion about Pythagoras, drawn from completely different evidence, is significant. The picture of Pythagoras that emerges from the most ancient testimony, not influenced by Plato, is that he was a hierophant of the great mother mysteries. Pythagoras was remembered as a shaman-like figure concerned for the purity of sacrifices and the correct dress to wear in holy places. His disciples were remembered as prophets of the voice of God, Mentius Theophonas, Diogenes Laertius 8:14. His movement was primarily religious, but concerned also with theories about the nature of the world. A surface reading of the Old Testament could identify the concern for pure sacrifices and correct dress in a holy place. Both the Hebrew priests and the followers of Pythagoras, wearing white but not white wool, but the scientific concerns are not immediately apparent in the Old Testament. Like the Rechabites, who may well have been refugees from the First Temple and its cult of the throne chariot, the followers of Pythagoras drank no wine and lived a celibate life. Like the temple mystics, such as those who compiled the Enochic Apocalypse of Weeks, the followers of Pythagoras had a panoramic view of human history. There was a man among the Pythagoreans who was transcendent in knowledge. When he extended all the powers of his intellect, he easily beheld everything as far as 10 or 20 ages of the human race. Porphyry Life of Pythagoras 30. The would-be disciples of Pythagoras had a 5-year period of probation during which they were permitted only to hear the master's voice but not to see him. Then they both heard and saw Pythagoras himself within the veil. Josephus described the Essenes as leading the same kind of life as the Pythagoreans, Antioch 15:4, and since he had spent some time in his youth with the Essenes, life 2, he will have been well informed. Both groups lived in silent communities. Both held goods in common. Both refused to swear oaths. Both practiced a morning ritual of praying towards the rising sun, all practices which could be observed by outsiders. Since, however, both groups also refused to divulge their characteristic teachings to anyone outside, and Josephus did not become a full member of the group, it will never be possible to know the full extent of the similarities between the Essenes and the Pythagoreans. One important characteristic of the Qumran community, who were probably Essenes, was their opposition to the temple in Jerusalem, and in particular to the high priesthood there. This was usually described as the wicked priest who robbed the poor and defiled the temple, e.g. as described in the Habakkuk commentary 1 Heb. The community saw themselves as both a temple and a priesthood in Exile 1, their inner council being the Holy of Holies. They had a text, 11Q Melch, which predicted the imminent return of Melchizedek, the eternal high priest of the first temple who had been present in the kings, reincarnated, Heb 1:10-4, and was also recognized in Jesus, Heb 7. The Melchizedek text mentions teachers who had been hidden and kept secret. The Damascus document mentions the hidden things in which all Israel had gone astray, CD 3, and also describes the era of the Second Temple as the age of wrath, CD warrant. The community looked to a righteous teacher, and since they had preserved the Enoch text, which also describes the Second Temple teachers as an apostate generation, we can assume that they regarded themselves as having preserved the teachings of the First Temple. These people, waiting for the return of the true high priest and the true teachings, were those whose lifestyle resembled that of the Pythagoreans. The most striking example of a correspondence between the tradition of the First Temple and that attributed to the Pythagoreans is the belief that there was a fire at the center of the universe, described by Kingsley as one of the most vexed questions in the history of Greek philosophy. What is described as the beliefs of the Pythagoreans, however, is exactly the lore of the Holy of Holies in the First Temple. This extraordinary fact is the context in which other, less obvious similarities must be considered. The whole matter is complicated by the paucity of sources, and by the uncertain channels through which the ideas on both sides were transmitted. It has been suggested that this central fire derived from the experience of volcanic phenomena in Sicily, or perhaps from Empedocles' theory of a fire at the center of the earth, but this does not explain the imagery used. Anatolius, writing in Alexandria in the 3rd century CE on the symbolic properties of numbers, said the Pythagoreans taught that at the center of the four elements there lies a certain unitary fiery cube. He adds a quotation from Homer to show that he understood the fiery cube to be Tartarus. One aspect of the problem, if we adopt the volcanic phenomena explanation, is to explain how the center of the earth became the center of the universe, and then how it came to be described as a cube. A second aspect of the problem is that the central fire had various names. It was Dios, Fulak, Zeus's sentry post, Aristotle on the Heavens 293b. A quotation from Aristotle's Lost. Work on the Pythagoreans gives more names, the more genuine members of the school. Regard fire at the center as the creative force which gives life to the whole earth and warms its cold parts. Some call it Xenos Purgos, Zeus's defense tower, Dios Fulake, and Dios Thronos, throne of Zeus, Simplicius, on the heavens, Phoebe 11:26. According to Philolaus, it was Hestia, Tupantos, the hearth of the universe, Dios Oikos, the house of Zeus, the mother of the gods, the altar, bond, and measure of nature, Aetius 2:7-7. Plato described it as the home of Zeus and the gods, and he gathered all the gods together in their most honorable home, which stands at the center of the universe and watches over everything that belongs to the world of becoming. Critias 100.120-23. This idea of the center of the universe as a watchpost is particularly striking. Usually in Greek, the idea of the gods watching over the world of mortals is associated with a view from high up in the heavens, not from the center of the universe. Kingsley observed, to call the Pythagorean central fire the throne or home of Zeus is incomprehensible from the standpoint of Greek mythology. A fiery cube at the center of the universe, however, which is the throne and home of God, describes exactly the holy of the holies in the first temple. The tabernacle temple represented the creation, and the Holy of Holies was the cube-shaped structure at the heart of it, which was the place of the divine presence in its midst. It was the place of the heavenly throne and the heavenly host, and a Greek would have described it as the throne of Zeus and the home of the gods. The holiest of holies was lined with gold, from KG 620, to represent the fire around the king and his beauty. Isa 33.1417, described in the earliest known ascent text as the second house built with tongues of fire. 1 and 14.15. The Holy of Holies was described as a tower in Isaiah 5-40. Migdal, LXX Pergos, and in Habakkuk 2.1 Macer, LXX Fulake, the very words used to describe the fiery center of the universe. Ezekiel's vision of the throne suggests that the Holy of Holies was seen as the mother of the sons of God, and that the Holy of Holies was the place. Of the measurements and engravings of the creation, it was the place from which the Lord looked out onto the created world. The Lord is in his holy temple, the Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes behold, his eyelids test the children of men. That this was the Holy of Holies of the first temple, which passed into the teachings of Pythagoras, is consistent with evidence in a much later source. Anatolius also observed that the Pythagoreans equated the number 1 with the center and with the present moment. The Holy of Holies was the ever-present eternity in the midst of the creation, as day 1 and also as the living one. It was the mother of the gods, the bond and measure of nature, and the source of life. Since the place where the atonement blood was offered was also within the Holy of Holies, it was also the altar. This degree of correspondence cannot be coincidence. Temple usage derived from mythology and temple practice attested elsewhere, but the origin and framework of the Pythagorean system remains a mystery, even though commentators frequently conclude that there must have been a mythology underlying the teachings of Pythagoras. The Pythagoreans also held that the creation was made from two, the limit paras and the unlimited apeiron, which corresponds to a remarkable degree to the teaching of the non-Deuteronomic stratum of Hebrew religion. For the Pythagoreans, limit was unity, goodness, and rest, and an odd number, and was also thought to be three-dimensional. Unlimited was the opposite, and an even number. The Pythagoreans have said there are two principles, archai, but added that the limited peperasmenon and the unlimited apeiron and the unity to hen were not the attributes of certain things, e.g. of fire or earth, or anything else of this kind, but that the unlimited itself and the one itself were the substance, ousia, of the things of which they are predicated. This is why number was the substance of all things. Aristotle Metaphysics A5987a. This implies that the limit was the one. Elsewhere it is recorded that the one was formed from limit and unlimited. They hold that the elements of number are the even and the odd, and of these the former is apeiron, unlimited, and the latter peperasmenon, limited. The one is from both of them, for it both, even and odd, and number from the one and numbers, as has been said, are the whole. Heaven. Metaphysics 986a. Some 2 centuries earlier, Deutero Isaiah had said of the heavens, "Lift up your eyes on high and see who created these. He who brings out their host," by BMSPR, which could be understood as causes their host to come forth by means of number. This implies that the limit and the unlimited together formed the one, which was the source of the creation. Aristotle criticized the Pythagoreans for this teaching. It is strange also to attribute generation to eternal things. Or rather, this is one of the things that are impossible. There need be no doubt whether the Pythagoreans attribute generation to them or not, for they obviously say that when the one hen had been constructed, whether out of planes or of surface or of seed or of elements which they cannot express, immediately the nearest part of the unlimited began to be drawn in and limited by the limit. Metaphysics N31091a. If the one was the first to be formed from limit and unlimited, this would correspond to day 1. Several Pythagorean teachings about the one suggest that it was. Originally, the Holy of Holies, which was day 1, it was envisaged as three-dimensional. It was good, it was the fiery cube, It was the first to be created, and it was hermaphrodite. Understood as the limit and the unlimited, these are strange expressions, but as bound and unbound, they immediately indicate the eternal covenant of the priestly tradition, the bonds of the eternal covenant, also described as the covenant of Selam, meaning peace and wholeness, integrity, characterize the older creation story in the Hebrew scriptures. The boundary or limit was fundamental to this system. The disordered was limited and defined by engraving and fixing. This process is indicated by the words from the root HKQ, although this is not clear from the variety of ways the word is translated into English. The Lord set bounds for the sea, Job 38:10, Jer.5:22, and ordinances for the heavens, Job 38:33, bounds, 148.6, bounds to the length of human life, Job 14.5, and a set limit, Job 14:13, 45, drew a circle on the face of the deep. Proverb 8. He described a circle on the face of the waters at the boundary between light and darkness. Job 26 and 46. Assigned to the sea its limit and marked out the foundations of the earth. Proverb 8:29. Made a decree for the rain. Job 28:26. The prayer of Manasseh described this vividly. Thou who hast made heaven and earth with all their order, who hast shackled the sea by thy word of command, who hast confined the deep and sealed it with thy terrible and glorious name. Prayer 3. One Enoch preserves fragments of a poem about the eternal covenant, and the great oath which forms the heavens and the earth, maintains the bounds of the sea, and keeps the sun, moon, and stars in their courses. 1 and 69. When these bounds were transgressed, the whole created order collapsed. They have passed over the laws, Torah, overstepped the statutes, but Heb is singular, the boundary limit, made ineffectual the everlasting covenant. Isa 24:5, translating literally. The unbound was the deep, which flooded over the earth in the time of Noah as a result of human wickedness, but did not exist in the new creation of John's vision, a new heaven and a new earth, and the sea was no more. Rev. 1. Everything was within the Holy of Holies, and so it was all limit. Binding, limiting the sea was the great sign of divine power. Job 26:10, 38:10, Job 5:22, Proverbs 8:27-29. Also, 104.9, using another word for boundary, Gabul. The Pythagoreans similarly conjectured that evil belongs to the unlimited and good to the limited. Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics, B6, 1106 BE. The limit was the essential nature of anything, as can be seen from the Pythagoreans' account of the creation. If their system was like that of the temple, then the heaven would have been the veil, the boundary around the one, and so what lies beyond the heaven is the unlimited, would have been the deep in the darkness outside the veil. Jen Memwu. This unlimited is taken in and limited, i.e., by the limit. Physics 203a. The fullest description of the process is also the most obscure. The Pythagoreans held that the void exists and that spirit and void enter into the heaven itself, which, as it were, breathes forth. The void, Kenyan, separates the natures. Physics 213b. This obviously corrupt wording could once have been an account like that in Genesis 1, if we understand the limit to be the creator, and the unlimited to be whatever the Spirit hovered over in order to create. The Spirit, by extending the divine influence, brought limit to the unlimited, and established the order of creation insofar as each nature was separated and distinguished. The first stage of this process in the biblical account was day 1, the Pythagorean one from which all things came forth. What lies beyond heaven, i.e., outside the veil of the temple, is unlimited until the limit beyond brings order, and thus a part of itself into the process. The earlier account of the creation underlying Genesis described a process of generation. These are the generations of the heaven and the earth when they were created, Gen 2:4, but the fatherhood element had been suppressed by the reformers. This is exactly the teaching 4, which Aristotle had criticized the Pythagoreans, namely that they attributed generation to eternal things. The similarities to the older temple tradition are clear. The Pythagoreans thus believed that the creation had a beginning, and Philolaus also taught that the cosmos would be destroyed, Aetius 2:3, another biblical element, Isaiah 45,008, and the whole of Gen 1. The end of the Genesis story was that what had been created and separated out was good, and that all was at rest on the Sabbath. The goal of the Hebrew creation story was order and rest, not motion, and the unity, goodness, and rest of the Pythagoreans can easily be linked to day one, the Holy of Holies. The Pythagoreans believed that the numbers were the principles of all things. The so-called Pythagoreans were the first to take up mathematics. They advanced this study, and having been brought up in it, they thought its principles were the principles of all things. In numbers, they thought they observed many resemblances to the things that are and that come to be, such and such an attribute of numbers being justice, another being decisive. Moments since all other things seem to be made in the likeness of numbers in their entire nature. Aristotle Metaphysics A5, 985b. The Pythagorean numbers remain a mystery. Barker even wondered if a quite specific mythical cosmogony forms the background of the Pythagorean number theory. Their numbers are mathematical, and yet in view of their spatial, concrete nature, they are not. They seem to be conceived as matter, hula, and yet they are something like form, eidos. They are in themselves being, ousia, and yet not quite so. How the one became the many, the numbers of the creation, is not clear, but in temple tradition, this would have been one of the secrets of the Holy of Holies. It was the Raz, Niyi of the Qumran wisdom text. It is therefore very interesting to read that the first secret revealed to Enoch when he stood before the throne was the division of the kingdom, 1:41:1, since the kingdom was one of the names by which the Holy of Holies was known. Isaiah observed the Holy One bringing out the host of heaven by number, Isaiah 40:26. A familiar text whose meaning is not immediately obvious. It could be describing how the first created beings were somehow associated with number. Pythagoras is also known for his teaching about the transmigration of souls, although which souls and under what conditions is not certain. He maintains that the soul is immortal. Next, that it changes into other kinds of living things, also that events recur in certain cycles, and that nothing is ever absolutely new, and finally that all living things should be regarded as kin. Pythagoras seems to have been the first to bring these beliefs to Greece. Porphyry Life of Pythagoras, 19. Transmigration of souls is not a term used in discussing biblical religion, but it could have derived from the Hebrew belief in the return of major figures such as Elijah or the great prophets. The evidence in the Gospels is late. Some say you are John the Baptist, and others Elijah, others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets, Matt. Fine, but the whole phenomenon of pseudepigraphy is ancient and has yet to be explained. It may have been based on the belief that the great figure actually returned in another lifetime to write these texts, and returned many times. Who wrote the books of Moses, and who rewrote parts of them to produce Deuteronomy? The scrolls of the prophets were augmented over the years by unknown figures whom we call disciples, but they may well have believed themselves to be the new embodiment of their master, giving new oracles. Coming in with the name of the Lord is another phrase to ponder, since all the kings were believed to be Emmanuel, God, with his people. And what of Melchizedek, the eternal priest who met Abraham was David and was Jesus? There was also the established practice of writing contemporary history as the past repeating itself. The return from the exile was a new creation, a new exodus, and also a new migration of Abraham. Isaiah 51 uses all three images. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE was described as the first destruction, witnessed by Jeremiah's scribe Baruch, second to Baruch, and Ezra writing the scripture in the mid-5th century. BCE was in fact the account of the collection of the Hebrew scriptures and the fixing of the canon at the end of the 1st century CE. Second, Esther 1003:1. In the 30th year after the destruction of our city, Second Esdras describes how Ezra dictated the scriptures to scribes. Pythagoras is said to have taught about daimons, beings intermediate between humans and God and to have believed himself to be midway between ordinary humans and God, Aristotle in Fragment 192. Pythagoras was remembered as divine, and his teachings were held to be of divine origin, Iamblichus on the Pythagorean Life 5, and the Pythagoreans claim to be able to see daimons, Aristotle Fragment 193. This bears a strong resemblance to the belief in apotheosis attested in the non-canonical texts of the Hebrew tradition. Certain humans were transformed and became mediators, usually of heavenly secrets or messages of judgment. That angels could be seen was never questioned. I think this is a good place to wrap up this video in the audio chapter series. If you enjoyed this content, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you're inclined. Until next time, make sure of all things hold fast to that which is good.